So, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll just give you a few more seconds for the magic of Zoom as it allows people in. Welcome all. We're going to wait just a minute or two while other people are assembling and joining. But while we are waiting, it would be very nice to find out where are you sitting today? You know, hello, I'm in London. Where are you folks today? Do put things in chat.
Keith, that means you went to the Taylor Swift concert.
Every night, Mike, every night, 8 times. Yeah, that's. Unfortunately, I had to say no, I haven't. Instead, I went to a rather more experimental music night last night.
Probably had a better time.
Who can say?
I've been to some of those nights. No.
You know exactly where I've been, Ian. So fantastic. We got people from all over. Yorkshire, Montreal, Ukraine, Bremen, Connecticut, US. Thanks very much for joining from America, Dublin, Italy, Austria, and a Frenchman in Brighton. Ah, interesting.
That sounds like a song. So
yes, fabulous. So welcome all. My name is Keith Damon-Dotzer. I'm the facilitator for this event, and I'd like to introduce you to this webinar where we're going to be talking about use cases and user stories, perfect partners. So in the introduction to this, we said use cases and user stories are 2 well-known ways to describe what a system is going to do and who it's going to provide value to. But when should you use both, and how should you integrate them seamlessly together? So that's really the topic of our webinar today. And in order to talk about this, I'm very excited to introduce you to a fantastic panel of people. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Mike Cohn, who all of you, I'm sure, will know, the XP guy, user story guy, author of many books, the go-to source for user stories and plenty more besides. We've also got Ian Spence, international use case expert, the writer of a really excellent book on use cases, also an Essence expert for those of you who know about Essence. And Ian has been the key creator of both what was use case 2.0, but also the current use case 3.0, which is just being released at the present time. And last but not least, we have Ivar Jacobson, known as one of the fathers of software engineering, inventor of component-based development, aspect-oriented engineering, co-creator of UML, Rational Unified Process, recipient of the Gustav Dalén Medal, which he keeps on telling me about. What is that medal, Ivar? What is that?
It's from Chalmers Institute of Technology, and it's after I was not prepared to answer this question, so I apologize if it. So it was Gustav Dalén was a Nobel Prize winner, and they created this prize, which is actually has a nickname, the Little Nobel Prize. So it's it was a big surprise, and actually I got it for use cases. So it is relevant for this discussion. Yeah. Very
pertinent, and of course, Ivar was the inventor of use cases, and so that's why he is a fantastic contributor for today. So maybe we should just start at the very beginning, and maybe if I could invite Mike just to tell us, if we're talking about user stories and use cases, well, just give us a quick view. What are user stories? What are they good for? And where do you think they're not so useful for? If you can give us that.
Sure, I'll start with that. I think of a user story as a short description of something that a user or customer wants in a product. We often hear it referred to as a promise to have a conversation or a pointer to a full-fledged requirement, meaning the user story itself is not a full-on requirement. And I think they came about in an era where use cases had started to get a little too complicated. You have a good idea and people start going, oh, here's a good idea, but let's add this and let's add this and let's add this. And I equate it to how my family does holiday dinners, right? When we started having holiday dinners, we'd have all the things that I grew up with. My wife would add all the things she grew up with. And then now we've got a son-in-law who's requested we have his favorite things on the same holidays, and things just get bigger. And so user stories came about as a reaction to that. And then now we've seen the same thing happen with user stories, where people are turning them into 8-page documents in Jira, and I've seen many longer than 8 pages. So anyway, short, simple statement telling us something that a user or customer wants.
Yes, thank you very much, Mike. So if that's what a user story is, I guess we should define our terms in terms what is a use case, and there's nobody better that can tell us that than Ivar Jacobson himself. So Ivar, if you want to just give us a description about what is a use case, and also maybe give us an insight of what do you think a use case is good for and what maybe use cases are not perfect for, if anything.
Yeah, let me start by how they came to life. It will not be a long story, but I was fed up with specifications, function specifications, and all kinds of requirement specification a long time ago. I didn't see the user in them, so I suggested that we look upon a system from a user's perspective, and I never really thought that was a great idea, to be honest. How could it be a great idea to think before you develop something, you think about how it's going to be used? But nowadays, we have gone through a couple of iterations on what is a use case, and it hasn't really changed in any way dramatically. But the definition today is that the use case is all the ways I have to look here, all the ways of using a system with a particular, to achieve a goal for a particular user. And the very important thing here is that the use cases are not the function decomposition that was so dominant if you go back in the 70s, 80s. It is something that the system offer, an entity offer it. So that is key for definition of use case. Well, we probably get into more as we talk here.
Goodness, thank you very much. And I guess something that Ivar was suggesting there, that there has been a sort of small evolution of the use case concept. And that's something that Ian Spence has been the prime mover for. So I don't know if, Ian, if you would like to say anything about what in particular use case 3.0 is targeting in the ways that perhaps previous iterations of use cases were not.
So if you look back, so when I wrote a book with Kurt Bittner on use cases, we identified some key things about the life cycle of a use case, and we identified different levels of detail and levels of description that you could do with a use case. When we moved to use case 2.0, that was post-Essence, so we essencified things a little bit. But the main thing in use case 2.0 was the concept of slicing, and the fact that the whole point of a use case is to tell a story, and that's a story with a little s, right? A narrative. There is a plot. There's a starting point, and there's steps, and there's interactions, and there's alternatives. So it's telling the whole story. With use case 3, we've been learning more of how people have been using use cases, and how people have been using use cases together with other techniques, including user stories, or some people are using features or various other ways. And one of the key things that we realized was that due to the popularity of agile, and particularly Scrum, and Kanban and their desire to have small work items, you have your use case, and even if you slice your use case up, they're probably still too big to be a work item, because they traverse from the beginning to end of the use case. So we've acknowledged that a bit more, tried to make that a bit more clear, that a use case and use case slice will need to be split up to create your work items. But also, particularly following discussions with Alistair Coburn on the recently published Use Case Foundation, a lot of people use use cases, but they don't have a use case model. They don't have a use case diagram. They just find a use case for the system, and then they describe it, and they generate user stories, and they build it, and they treat it just as a way to focus on an area of the functionality of the system. But equally, something we're more cognizant of ourselves, a lot of people have a use case model, and but they don't actually write any use cases. They treat the use case as a context for a set of conversations. All right, so this is the use case. Okay, what stories are in there? And then they just go straight to stories. But they then have more of a context, which makes it easier for them to scope manage and see the whole. So use case 3.0 is more flexible. It allows you to combine these different ways of using use cases and combine them with other practices like user stories. So those are the benefits, really, Keith, I think.
Yes, thank you very much.
That isn't surprising to me, Ian, in that, people tend to want to do the least possible. And if I can write a bunch of user stories or draw a picture, and that gets me 80% of the way, people tend to stop there, right? I mean, and that's probably appropriate on a lot of systems, right? I think there's that, there's the trivial systems where people just, build it yourself. And then there's the massive systems. And those would definitely need both. There's probably a big middle ground there where people are well enough off with the model or the narrative, the descriptions.
All right. Something a long time ago, Mike, me and one of my colleagues went on one of your Scrum classes back in London a long time ago.
Yep.
And you said, write some user stories. And me and my colleague, we just looked at each other and went, okay, what are the use cases? Okay, there'll be some stories in there. So we just did that as naturally, because that's how we started. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of value in having a big picture that implies the boundary of your system, shows the main things. It can stop you going off into the weeds of all those, there's lots of stories over there, but we're not doing them. Right?
Oh, absolutely. I've long argued about Scrum in particular having a problem with its short iterations, which, by the way, I absolutely love, but it can lead to kind of sub-optimization where you're only focused at what do I need in the next 2 weeks. And, you do that, and you're like, and you look back and go, what have I accomplished? And it's like, you kind of missed the big goal. And I lobbied Ken Schwaber for years that we needed something bigger in there, because I've always taught that. I mean, literally going back to my first Scrum class in 1997, taught that we needed a bigger goal than just the one sprint. Now finally got into Scrum as the product goal, which I typically look at as something, 3-6 months out. So it's not, you can tell you're making progress towards it, but it's got to be something bigger than just 2 weeks away.
It's funny also, when Ivar was speaking about what was the motivator for use cases, and I guess, Mike, you were saying about the user stories. In both cases, is to focus people back to what the user actually wants in the first place. And yet it does seem that we repeatedly, as a kind of industry, kind of retreat from that and don't connect with the customer, don't talk to the user. What do you think is actually causing that sort of behavior that has been course corrected by the invention of use cases and course corrected by the invention of user stories, but ends up with your 8-page Jira user stories? Anybody have a thought about what is it that is this behavioral?
I think it's a number of things. I think it's a lot of us are introverts. I absolutely am. And if I can sit at my desk and pretend I think I know what my user needs, I'll do that. instead of actually go talk to them. And that's a common mistake. That means my ego is getting in the way, thinking I know what my users want. And also a bit of laziness, right? It's just easier to make it up myself instead of go do a bunch of interviews. And then fourth time pressure, right? Because I'm under time pressure, I'll just kind of wing it. I'll just take some guesses. And so we end up thinking about it without doing the actual research or conversations with users. And that, to me, I wasn't writing software in the 70s, but I certainly was in the 80s. But that probably goes back to the dawn of time, right? It's like, well, it's just easier to think about it than to go talk to people. I think it's just kind of who we are.
Anybody else have a view on this? Okay. By the way, we have a Q&A section in for the webinar, so do please put your questions in there at the time. And I do notice that Jeff has put a question in there, and he's basically saying, well, what differentiates a use case from a large user story?
I'll start with that. I think there's a number of key differences with use cases and user stories just in general, whether they're large or small. Use cases tend to be written to document an agreement, right? So that we can pass them back and forth, we can agree on it, and in many cases we might sign off and saying, yep, that's what we're going to build. Where user stories are not that rigid, they're not really meant to be used that way. I think use cases are a part of a project's permanent record. I might look back at use cases that were written 5 years ago. Pretty hard pressed to think I'm going to look back at user stories that were written 5 years ago, because a lot of times the user stories are very much augmented by conversations, and looking at a piece of text on a index card isn't going to give me that additional context. So I think, that permanency is part of the difference. I don't know if I'd say use cases are abstractions of big user stories, because I could probably say that the other way around if I wanted. I mean, they're both just kind of big descriptions. And we were having a little bit of conversation before we set this up about, it seems natural to go from use case to user story, right? We've got the big use case. As Ian said, use cases are often too big to bring into a short 2-week iteration, so we turn them into stories. But we also talked about how it is possible to go from a user story to a use case, but in that case, it would be some big, massive user story, which I kind of equated to somebody more saying, I want the product to do X. Right. And I guess that's a user story, the way I've just defined user story, but it's not very precise. It's just like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if our system did such and such? And I don't know, that's a story, but I don't really think of it that way.
Thank you.
I think if we go back to use cases in early 1990s, we recommended that you actually start by finding something the normal way of using the system for that use case. So it's a basic flow, and the basic flow could very well be seen as a user stories today. But yep. At that time, we recommended people to start thinking about the basic flow, and we gave usually a use case name that was related to that basic flow. So we recommended they have start with a verb, and that corresponds to the basic flow.
Well, I think it was your object-oriented software engineering book, you talked about use case narratives. And that to me was a user story, right? Just short, simple text about something that has to happen. And that to me was a user story, and, just got a different name eventually.
Yeah, a use case was structured that way, very similar to what we say today. Namely, you had a basic flow and you have alternative flows. And so that is the key idea is very similar to what we had many years ago, but it has developed. And I must admit that when we did use case 2.0, we had a different way of thinking than we have today. Today, we think that a practice that originates from someone we shouldn't try to change it. We should accept as it is and not incorporate. So what we did in use case 2.0, we incorporated something similar to user stories, and we wouldn't do that today. We think user stories is a very different practice, and use cases is another practice.
I would go a little further. People are obsessed with symmetry. A is a B doesn't mean all A's are B's, doesn't mean all B's are A's. Right? When we wrote use case 2.0, we used the word story with a little letter S, just to mean somebody telling a story. And everyone thought it meant user story. Right? There's the whole point. Use cases have always been about telling a story. Right? There's a start.
It has always been like that, but yes.
It's always been like that. But not all stories are user stories. All right. And one of my things, one of the things we struggle with is, and I was trying to remember which character in Alice in Wonderland it was. I always thought it was the Cheshire Cat, but I think it actually was the caterpillar who said, what do the words mean? And they said, they mean whatever I want them to mean. Right? So user stories and the format as I want, so that could be used to express any level of goal. Right?
Yeah.
And Alistair has his different goal levels, sea level, kites, and all this kind of stuff. But use cases express a goal at a particular level, the level of a system boundary with an event that starts them. A use case is all the ways of achieving the goal. Right? Now, most people, when they do a user story, it doesn't cover all the things that could go wrong when that user story is happening, and things like that. So, yes, if you just wrote all the as a I want so that statements, you could filter them by goal level, and some of them would probably be candidate use cases. My experience is when you try and make all these things recursive, right, use cases all the way down, user stories all the way down, whatever it is, people just get very confused. Right? So I personally like user stories as ways to capture small things that a team can do in a short amount of time. And if they're too big, we split them up and we throw the original away, right? Use cases, we don't split them up. The use case is telling the whole story. So it's however big it happens to be. We can slice it by value, but those slices might still be too big, right? And you get to the point where slicing by value stops. So then you start to split it up. So I like to say that user stories were well-formed ones are small enough to do in a couple of weeks and all those kind of things. What they are before they become well-formed ones, I'm not that bothered about. Right? But
I think that's one of the reasons why stories got popular is to my understanding, and I went back and I'd read a bunch of older requirements books when I wrote my book on user stories. User stories were the first requirements technique that when you were considering whether it was a good one or not, it considered the size, right? Nobody said the system shall statements need to be done in 2 weeks, right? And that wasn't a thing with use cases. Use case, capture what we need to do, whether it's big or small, whatever. And user stories were the first requirements technique that said, okay, got to capture what you got to do, but they got to be tiny as well. They have to be a certain size even. I think that was important in helping user stories start to become popular in the early 2000s. I think Anna made a good comment in the chat, which is about many people avoid use cases and choose stories because they're require learning and they're more difficult. And I absolutely think that's a factor in things. We've had some hear in some internal discussions as well about that it can be that people just want to do the easiest thing possible, don't want to be pinned down. And with the user story, things are a lot more vague. And did we meet the spirit of the user story is sometimes considered, rather than, did we do absolutely everything that was specified, because we don't think of a story as a specification. And so I think that desire to not be pinned down, and Anna's comment about they're harder, is what leads people in many cases to stories. They're just easier.
Fabulous. So yeah, we're starting to get into really good ideas. So let's drill in a little bit more to, hey, well, if use cases and user stories are both useful techniques, then how could we go from use cases to user stories? I was wowing our guests with my amazing animation before we started, so now everybody's going to get a chance to see them. But if we're starting from the idea, from somebody, a customer, a user, or maybe the business, and then you get a group of people together to discuss whether that's something that we should go ahead with or not. And when I showed this, I think, Mike, you were saying, hey, well, that arguably that speech bubble thing could be construed to be a user story in some sort of way at that moment in time.
We could. I think it's probably an immense one, and I don't think we benefit from calling it a user story, right? I mean, it's like, to me, that speech bubble there is like, I'd like a word processor that's better than Word and Google Docs, right? It's awfully darn big, whether we call it a user story or a use case. It's awfully darn big. No one's going to do anything with it except split it into smaller things.
Yeah. So with the topic of this webinar, we're saying, well, use cases and user stories. So I think we're suggesting that the next thing would be that you could do some model storming or identification and actually identify a use case, the use case model, as Ian Spence had sort of described, to really describe, what's the scope of the work, who is it meant to serve, what is it meant to do, and use that as a discussion document to really become clearer about it. So now, I guess we have the point where we might have a use case model. There's numbers of use cases there. So we have to choose one, so we choose one, maybe based on priority, about what's going to be the most valuable thing first. And we sort of look at that. And so the rest of this webinar, I think really, we're going to talk about, what is the strategy from, breaking down that use case into one or more user stories, because presumably there could be at least one pattern to do that, or maybe a number. And I think maybe one was mentioned already. So I'll hand over back to any of our guests to really suggest, from that point, what's the simplest way to go from there to then create a backlog of user stories? And under what circumstances would that be a useful technique to use?
Ian, you want to start with that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the commonest ways that I've seen people do are, one, a use case model is great to get agreement on the major things that a system should be doing, who uses it, what supporting systems and things there are. So that's a great thing to start with scope management. You can find use cases and say, we're not doing that, right? So you can de-scope. When you pick the one that you want to work on, you've got the very simple technique is we take that and we just say, okay, let's have some conversations about what user stories there are involved in Browse and Shop. Right, and you can just brainstorm those user stories. Next week, I believe I'm doing a session with Jeff Patton on use cases and story maps. Right? A use case is a story map in context. Right? It has a backbone, the basic flow, and then you find all the other kinds of things. So a lot of people just take the use case and you treat it like a story map. They find the stories, they go, these are the ones we need, we could leave these, we'll package these up for later. And then they just start the process of getting those stories going forward. Some people then add a little bit more of the use case slicing ideas. So they use a story map to find slices. The benefit there is that you can then make sure you test each slice end to end and don't just test the individual stories. But so that's one route. You just use the use case model as a visual picture of your scope. Inside each of the use cases, you find a load of stories. You say whether you're doing them or not, and off you go. The other way is...
Can I just halt you there? Because it's interesting what you were saying. We're saying, hey, you could just start with the use case and then brainstorm some stories. But then you said, hey, well, you could use a story map. Do you think it's an essential component to actually use a story map to describe the structure and the relationship of those user stories together? Or do you think that's a nice to have? And if it is essential, what is it adding?
This will come down to the complexity of your use case, right? If your use case has many steps and many alternatives in it, then a story map with a backbone of the main activities involved and all the things would be a great way to find the stories. If the use case is really simple and straightforward and doesn't have that kind of complexity, then you might spend more time trying to figure out what the backbone was than you did finding the stories to get you started. So again, it's all that size and complexity kind of stuff. Right? And also it depends if you consider a sheet of paper with a line that says in scope and out of scope, and you put some above and some below, if you consider that story map or not. So that's part of that. Right?
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted. What was your other sort of selection process?
The other way is to go down the more traditional route and say, here's the use case. Let's come up with the basic flow and let's brainstorm alternatives and let's have discussions about completeness and have we got all this stuff, and then use that as the map of the territory that you then slice up. And then if you need user stories, you find user stories for each slice. You've got to make a decision about how your teams are going to manage their work items. All right. We did a use case course, Keith and I, the other week, and nearly everyone, their teams were doing user stories. Right. When they say they're doing user stories, they expect little tickets, possibly written in the official Mike Cohn user story format in Jira. That's what they expect. They don't really care where they come from. They weren't involved in coming up with them. They're not involved in the discussion. That's the ticket they want in Jira, right? So all these people on the course were going, this will be great because we can take these use cases and then we can generate the right tickets to feed to the team and they won't be disturbed and we can do the testing and the stuff around the outside. So, but the more traditional one is you would create a use case narrative, as Mike was talking about earlier, and it would sketch out the basic flow, the alternatives, and you would use that to start conversation with all your stakeholders, but it would become more part of your permanent record. You would be able to track what you've done and what's left to do and things like that. You don't need to generate all the stories for the whole use case. You could just focus in on individual flows and things like that. So that's the other way. The end result is always you start to populate a backlog of user stories. But I think as Mike was saying, get browse and shop working, that's a good product goal. Right. Maybe you could do that in a sprint, maybe it'd make a sprint goal. But they give you that big picture. And one of the favorite things I've seen people do is they have the use case diagram on the wall and they add a little bar chart, right? It could be the number of stories in the use case, the number of slices or whatever. And as they do them, they tick them off and they can visually see where they've been putting their effort in, right? Because maybe you should do one of those, a bit of work on some of those other use cases before you keep doing stuff in browse and shop, right? So it helps you get that goals and focus. And those are the two main ways. One is just get the use case up on the board and say what stories are in here. The other one is to sketch out the flow of events and then evolve that until you come up with some stories. We've done this as exercises in classes where teams have chosen different routes and they come up with pretty close to the same thing. Right? So horses for courses, Keith.
Yeah, and I have a slide just for what Ian has
Keith,
just.
can I add a little bit more onto that?
Absolutely.
go on. So we're talking about how do we go from use case to user story. Very practically, what I would think about is looking at the main success scenario of a use case, or the main path through the story. Boom, there's a story, might be a big story, so we'll split it, but it's already converted to a story. Second would be to look at any of the extensions, right? Each of those extensions is its own story. Third, I'd look at the preconditions and perhaps do a story where we relax one of the preconditions. For example, maybe we've got a precondition that says, you know, that all the numbers are positive, right? Not negative numbers. And we might go, well, it's too hard to clean up the data this sprint. Let's just let anything through. So we'd relax that precondition. Next sprint, we'd have a story enforcing the precondition. And then I do the same thing with post conditions of a use case where maybe not all of the post conditions are met by a simple story, and we'll add support for the post conditions in the later story. So those are the four very specific ways I would think about going immediately directly from a use case into a user story.
Oh, fabulous. Yeah. And I guess what you're saying is that you're using the precision of the description of a use case there in order to identify these things, because we've been talking about basic flows, alternate flows, and on the slide I'm just showing what we mean for those of you who are not necessarily working with use cases every day, just a textual description of the sequence of steps of the happy path for the basic flow, and then what might go wrong. And as Mike was saying, hey, there might be some preconditions before you're even allowed to start the use case, and there certainly might be some post conditions. And so these are clear things that you might capture as part of the use case. Mm-hmm. So we have collected two patterns there of actually doing this. We've also had some choices about how complex or how to visualize them, depending on story map or not. I guess everybody in the audience has heard those two patterns, but maybe you know of another one that you apply on a daily basis to go from use cases to user stories. And if so, it would be fantastic if you would capture that in the meeting chat at some point in time. As a pause, I might just ask, because it would be interesting. We have about quite a lot of people on the webinar today. Just it'd be interesting to know: do you use use cases in your daily work, and do you use user stories in your daily work? So hopefully a poll has just popped up in front of you, just to let us know. So simple answers, but it would just be interesting. You know, are use cases something that are used every day? You know, are user stories used by you or the teams that are around you every day?
So there is a third pattern for use cases and user stories, Keith.
That's what I want to hear. You don't need to type it into chat, Ian.
Well, I was just going to say, sometimes people build something based on user stories, and then they have to come up with the use cases to explain what on earth you can do with it.
Yeah.
Right, in all seriousness. Right. And for many systems, including very popular ones like Java, the actual use cases were not what they started with.
Yeah.
Right? So use cases as a way of tracking the emergent use of your system is another way, right, of using them.
Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah, so retrospective technique. I've just put the answers there. So we have, as we expected, vast majority of people using user stories or in their work. More mixed, but still 2/3 of the group today, which I guess is not surprising because it's probably self-selecting. People seeing use cases, and Ivar joining the webinar is likely to come and also likely to be using them back in the office every day. Okay. You mentioned also slicing, Ian, as sort of one concept there. Could you say a little bit more about that, and is it related to producing user stories?
If you look at that use case there that Keith has put up, things to note are it's probably wrong. You can probably find problems with it, things missing, things that shouldn't be happening. That's the power to get that conversation started. But if you were going to be building this system, you might not need all those alternative flows, right? You might want to start chunking this thing up. So what we talk about is slicing a use case. And the first slice should always be the basic flow, because if you implement and test the basic flow, something working, I always like to use the ATM, Keith. All right. So when you get to testing, you need an actual person like Keith using the ATM. So you put your card in, Keith, then what do you do? You're not talking, Keith, are you?
I'm just nodding. Sorry, I put my card in. I'm going to be typing in my PIN code. I expect to.
And what is the PIN code?
I'm not telling you. I'm not falling for that this time.
So
No wonder he's overdrawn.
well, he's our test case. We do 1,000 times a day. We take £100 out of Keith's account. Yeah. If you build the test case for someone with a bank account, a card, a valid PIN number, the money in their account, take out of it, that should always work, no matter how many alternatives, exceptions, errors, and stuff you build in. So if you start with the basic flow, even just one test case, maybe test-driven development, maybe you're not even checking the PIN number at this point because we know it's right. Right. So the basic flow, the main scenario, the happy day scenario, is always a great place to start. The thinnest slice of that would be one test case. But the slice is not just a slice of the use case, it's all the other bits. Right. So the first slice may have stubs for the PIN for the security. You might have stubs for checking the bank account.
That would be relaxing the preconditions the way I was describing it to some extent, right? That, you know, the entry PIN is valid or something. So
yeah. And then so you stub those things up, and then you can, as you add those in and build those bits, you can keep running and add more test cases and look at all the alternatives and stuff like that. The alternatives often are related to various things. So you might have in an ATM, you might have a whole series of alternatives related to card handling. Maybe you just want to do all the card handling in one go. So take that slice. There's probably some things, in this case, there might be things you just don't want to do. So the idea of slicing up the use case is slicing up into chunks of value that can then be delivered separately, with the proviso you always start with the basic flow. What we find with use cases are not very good backlog items. Right? Generally, you don't need all of any one use case to get started. But you probably need the basic flow of quite a few use cases just to get going. I've always maintained, one day someone will give me some better numbers, 60 to 80% of all software is error handling. And you don't need any error handling if it doesn't work. So get it working, get something working, and all of those kind of things. Think about risk, relaxing preconditions. So the ability to slice the use case is to get away from people trying to do the whole use case and looking for every possible alternative in the history of the universe ever before they start working on the basic flow. But think of it as not just a slice through the use case, it's a slice through everything, and particularly tests. So when we create a use case slice, the first thing we do is write the test cases.
Fabulous. Thank you very much.
I could add to that that once upon a time, aspect-oriented software development was popular. And that was around 2000, beginning of 2000. Unfortunately, it fell out of favor because it reminded too much of patching. But in the early 2000s, we actually wrote a book about how you do aspect on the software element with use cases. Use cases were ideal aspects. You could extend a use case with another use case. And that is these extension points that we call it were in aspect-oriented programming. There was a programming language in Java that was aspect Java and aspect J, and it had point cuts. So the beauty of that is that you can add things without changing what already works. And whereas if you don't have that kind of constructs, you would have to go in and put in a decision box, an if then else statement, and basically destroy the core idea, the basic flow. So slicing has had many values, not only for identifying identifying backlog items, but actually also for developing the system in iterations. So very early, actually, when we developed a system with many use cases, we didn't take one use case after the other. We took a few of the paths, we call it the scenarios, through the use case, and took a little from one use case, a little from another use case in some priority order. So we didn't take one use case and implemented it completely in one go. We took a little from several use cases.
That's interesting. And I guess as we have a discussion with Jeff Patton in a future webinar, where I guess a story map actually also might represent multiple use cases in one go, that might be another topic that comes up again for us to talk about. I have a question.
That is on, let me just add, that is on Thursday.
On this Thursday, Ian, yes.
Yeah, and it's...
in next Thursday. Is this Thursday?
It is.
Yes.
This, yeah, absolutely. So, and of course, everybody who's attended this webinar, you're very welcome to join us talking to Jeff Patton on Thursday, talking about use cases and story maps. I would like to ask.
And that is, sorry, Keith, but you have to say that is an essence for agility meetup.
Yes, yeah. The access to it is from the meetup website.
If you could send
I can try to get the link.
That'd be useful.
Yeah, I will do that.
I will. Okay.
I will do that. There's a number of questions that came in the Q&A. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm not sure if I'll be able to ask them all at this moment in time, but somebody did ask, what's the trade-offs or considerations of user stories without use cases? Because that's obviously a choice, isn't it? So anybody like to answer that question? What's the trade-offs or considerations if you're going to use user stories without use cases?
I'll start with that. I think one of the risks there is that you lose the big picture with the screen that you're still sharing. It's real easy, as Ian pointed out, to say, have I thought of everything, right? Or, what is missing here? Mm-hmm. And if I'm looking at a row of, a typical backlog, which is kind of a row, a list of things, it's a little bit harder to notice if something's missing. Story maps can help alleviate that quite a bit. I still think it's a little bit easier with use cases to see if you've thought of everything or where omissions are. So that'd be the biggest one.
Thank you. Anybody else got something to add?
Well, it's all trade-offs. If you don't have a use case model, you won't get stuck in use case modeling hell. Right? If you won't write use cases, you won't get stuck in use case authoring hell, as it were. So it's all trade-offs. Following our introduction, I did start trying to draw a new diagram. Right. If you have use cases, they provide more context, as we've seen. Right. But is your context transient or permanent? And if it's going to be permanent, will it be kept up to date? Right. I'm sure we've all had experiences where we've looked at the permanent record for a system and it's just all completely wrong. Right. I used to be in the modeling trade, and we reverse engineered a load of code once, and the architect was literally in tears because every single rule that he'd put in the architecture had been broken. There were tunnels through the layers, everything, all hell was going on. But if you want to know what it did, you had to look at the code. That's the only thing you could trust. Right? So there's an investment in keeping these things long term. Right? How long is this system going to do what are your immediate goals? How long do you expect it to survive? I'm clearly a big fan of use cases, and I like to have the big picture. But when you start looking at how long and how big these systems, I did some work. Been my pleasure and privilege to work with the Square Kilometre Array, building the world's biggest science facility. It's on the internet, big radio telescope. They've done huge numbers of, I mean, they're using SACE. They've done huge number of features, and you could times that by 10 for the number of stories. So they've literally done hundreds of thousands of stories. How do you work out what on earth that thing can do? Right. So they have a use case model with about 25 use cases that helps them focus on what they need to get in their first release that was coming up, and how they're going to build it. Helps them talk to the scientists and things like that. So
I think that is a great point, Ian. For such a really huge system, you had 25 use cases. And I guess the number of user stories were dramatically bigger. If I know user stories, but when I got the question, I was many times in panels, and I often got the question, how many use cases have a big system? And at that time, I said 12, just to make an odd number, 12. And that talks about the size in some way. And that was really valuable. You can, with 12 use cases, you can get the understanding of a big system in a very short while.
Well, I mean, the thing about this big radio telescope, it doesn't do very much. It's just incredibly complicated. Look over there. That's
Yeah.
Yeah.
But correlating, because the Earth is round, allegedly, not flat. Even if it's flat, the stuff will hit it at different times. So you've got to correlate all the data from 100,000 antennae to get it all accurate. It's fascinating stuff, but they've done literally hundreds of thousands of user stories. And many more to come.
Fabulous. Okay, so I think I should probably start wrapping it up now, if that's okay. So we've had the discussion about use cases and user stories. It sounds like we've sort of agreed that there are circumstances when it's useful to have both. And we've also heard of 3 different techniques from the speakers about how to actually convert use cases into user stories. If I'm correct. Is there anything final to say about that before we say goodbye to our attendees? And any final words from Mike, Ivar, or Ian about this topic?
Well, I'll add one more thing. One of the reasons that the SKA added use cases was, with their huge powers of user stories and features, the people who were meant to be doing the independent verification had no idea where to start.
Mm-hmm.
Have those scenarios and stuff like that. So use cases are a great way to shape the end-to-end system, stroke acceptance, whatever people like to call it nowadays, testing of the system. And the ability then to just, if you have just your use case model, as you do stories, just stick them onto the use cases. And then you've got a visual barometer of where you've put all your effort, which is incredibly powerful. All right. And things like that. So.
Thank you. Fabulous. So well, I guess what's our intention after this, Ivar? Because I know we were speaking before we started this that we would like to really kind of collect together and document these patterns. They're not necessarily brain science, but they might be useful for us to share afterwards. Would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think it would be extremely valuable if this initiative can result in something tangible, like a number of patterns for how to integrate use cases and user stories And I think we have heard from Mike, you mentioned 4 cases. And I think, and Ian added something. So if we could identify a number of patterns and describe them in some light way, it would be a real contribution to integrating use cases and user stories.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And I've noticed something that just came in chat, which might be useful, because I guess we're trying to connect 2 different sort of techniques together. And somebody had asked, what's the difference between actors and personas? And we talk about users here. How do we differentiate these? Because that could be a confusion, couldn't it, in people actually trying to navigate to this space. Use cases talks about actors. User stories clearly are for users, and many people use design thinking tools with personas. I don't know if there's any one of you 3 would like to just try and disentangle those things.
I
would be happy to try, but I expect the feedback, if positive or negative. I think actors are more abstract than personas. So an actor can actually be represented by many different personas. A persona can actually represent several actors too. So they are similar, and but they are also related.
I often, in working with user stories, I often miss the ability to have a system actor, right? So I think that's the advantage. I think actor is in many ways a good term. I like user as the term, though, because it reinforces that most of them should be about real users. Maybe not on a massive telescope that doesn't do much, but all the user does is look through, right? But I like the emphasis on the user, but I do often miss being able to call them actors. And I'll talk about that in classes, how it's like, yeah, I think it's good to call stories, but we still might have some non-human actors. So, and then I think personas are just a more specific representation where, we're getting into the details of a type of user or type of actor, making it more tangible.
So, a couple of things I would say. A list of actors is less likely to get you into trouble than a list of personas. I still remember one of the major American publications, What Your Bank Thinks of You, and they published the personas basically verbatim from a banking development team.
Yeah, I remember that.
Stupid old person and stuff like that. So they're less likely to get you into trouble. As we see nowadays, you won't know if it's a person or a machine, right?
True.
You just won't know, right? Even when your daughter phones you up, it may be a deep fake, right? So an actor is a role with respect to a system. A user is typically defined with regards to their role to the context, not the system. So, but yes, if you have an actor, you could describe the personas of the different users. But a user can play many roles with respect to the system and can even play them simultaneously. All right. So, so there is a thing. So we always used to have a list of users, and then we'd say, well, and here's a list of actors. What's the relationship between them? Right. And then for those users, we could do personas. Right. But I think we're moving further and further away from the is the actor a person or a system? I think particularly as we start to see the role that AI is going to become an actor to many systems.
Yeah.
AIs and stuff like that. I'd like to know, did you have any use cases of your AI then, Mike? Because you've got an AI, haven't you?
We do have an AI chatbot. We didn't do any use cases for it. We just mostly just started as a tech fun project. We were just kind of playing around and then just kept adding to it. So
fabulous. So yes, is that available online now, Mike?
Yeah, we just have it's called GoatBot, just goatbot.mountaingoat software.
Fantastic. So there you go, something to play with afterwards.
But is it for user stories or is it for Scrum?
It's trained on everything I've ever written or said. So.
Okay.
So-
So I'm going to go see what it says about use cases. It'll have something because I have read about use cases.
So you can ask it all your questions and see if Mike got them right, Keith.
There we go.
Fabulous. So we're back on the hour. Thank you very much for all.
Can I
Absolutely.
say you asked for some last words, right, from us, and I waited. I could let Mike say something before I say something. Do you have anything to add, Mike?
Not any further.
So what I think was the biggest surprise to me about use cases is that it became a normal English word, and that I never expected, of course. And now we find use cases on basically anything, from being a simple shop selling candies to very complex systems like self-driving cars or similar. And that is, of course, very valuable, because now we can talk a language to people who are not really interested in the technology, but they want to know what is this thing, what can this thing help us with. So, and then if we can find some seamlessness from the way people talk in normal language into how we actually implement, whether it's now software or systems or businesses or whatever, it makes it easier to collaborate with all kinds of people and organizations. So that was my biggest surprise, if I say so.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Ian, any parting words?
I think that it's useful for people to understand many practices, so they can pick the ones that will fit them best. Right? What's good about the combination of use cases and user stories is if the development team love user stories, you can keep them happy.
Yeah.
One of the issues that's rarely talked about, a lot of teams who do user stories, their user stories are dreadful. I mean, it might as well just be a task list. Right? They don't. But they will be small, and that is very powerful. So I think there's a good combination, and what we've tried to do in use case 3 is pull out the very lightweight ways you can benefit from use cases. But if you keep going, you could get all the way to use case driven development, which probably not for everyone. But and I don't think it's particularly, there isn't one true way of using them together. People should experiment, but I don't think it's particularly complex when you take into account the size thing that Mike mentioned. Right? The goal is to end up with small, well-formed user stories to feed your teams to do quickly. Use cases can help with that. Right. But if you can get directly to them, then that's cool as well.
Fabulous. Okay, and with those words, I guess let's call it a day. Thank you very, very much, Mike, for joining us, for Ivar for joining us, and for Ian as well. And thank you to everybody else who's actually joined. I hope you found that useful. Do find us on LinkedIn for the Reframing Use Cases group and join the discussion. Just see us on Thursday as we talk to Jeff Patton about story maps and use cases. And look out in the future for a use case 3.0 information on the ivarjacobson.com website, and also information about these patterns as we produce them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.